Helena Whitman walked into the Cardinal Heritage Credit Union at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning in October. It was her first day as CEO. She had a plan. The plan didn't survive 20 minutes. She took the elevator down to the second sub-level, the operations floor. She wanted to see the place without filters. No prepared tours, no department heads polishing their pitches. Just the building, the people, the machine. What she found was a man asleep at his desk. His head was down, resting on his folded arms. 24 monitors glowed behind him, alerts scrolling. Status lights blinking amber and red. The kind of screen activity that should have someone watching it. Nobody was watching it. Helena stopped walking. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. The recognition that she'd just been handed her first real test, and the answer was right in front of her. She didn't ask questions. She didn't check the screens. She read the badge on his desk. Marcus Reeves, Senior Infrastructure Engineer. She turned to the security officer, trailing behind her. Wake him up. Take his badge. Walk him out of the building. Marcus lifted his head slowly. His eyes were red. He looked at Helena for a long moment, like a man trying to figure out which dream he was still in. When he understood, he tried to speak. "Ma'am, there's something you need to know about the core authentication." "Stop." Helena's voice was flat. "I'm not interested in excuses on my first day. Please, 30 seconds, that's all I'm asking. Mr. Reeves, I've made my decision. You're suspended pending HR review. Hand in your badge." He looked at her then. Not with anger, not with fear, with something else. The specific look of a man watching a slow-motion accident he can't prevent. He didn't argue. He didn't list his accomplishments. He didn't ask for another chance. He just took off his badge, placed it on the desk, picked up his coffee mug. The mug had a child's drawing taped to it, a stick figure of a girl holding a rabbit. Before he walked out, he looked at a younger engineer at a nearby station, Tyler Chen, a kid Marcus had been mentoring for 2 years. "Tyler, whatever happens today, don't restart the core." Tyler nodded. He didn't know what it meant. He just nodded. Marcus walked to the elevator. The whole floor watched him go. Helena watched too. She felt good about it. She felt like a leader. She had no idea what she had just done. To understand what Helena had walked into, you have to go back 48 hours. Cardinal Heritage was a regional credit union, headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio. 500,000 members across 4 states. Mostly working people, teachers, nurses, auto workers, retired folks living on fixed incomes, small business owners, the kind of customers who couldn't afford to lose a single paycheck. The bank had been around since 1947. It was the kind of place where the systems were old, but they worked, the way an old truck works. You don't replace it, you keep it running. Marcus Reeves had been there for 15 years. He was 41. Quiet, the kind of guy who wore the same brand of plaid shirt for a decade and didn't think about it. He'd come up through the ranks the slow way. Help desk, junior admin, network engineer, senior infrastructure engineer. He knew the systems the way a master mechanic knows an engine he's rebuilt 3 times. Every quirk, every patch, every workaround somebody added in 2011 that nobody had ever bothered to document. He'd been a single father for 4 years. His wife, Sarah, had died of pancreatic cancer when their daughter was 3. Marcus never took bereavement leave. He came back to work the Monday after the funeral and quietly went on. The company never asked if he was okay. He never told them he wasn't. His daughter's name was Lily. She was 7 now. She liked drawing rabbits. She had a stuffed one named Mr. Pebbles she'd had since her mom was alive. She didn't go anywhere without it. Marcus tried very hard to keep her life stable. School, soccer practice on Wednesdays, pancakes on Saturday mornings. He didn't always get it right, but he tried. On a Sunday night, around 11 p.m., he was at his kitchen table with a laptop open. He was doing what he always did on Sunday nights, reviewing the weekend logs. That's when he saw it. A pattern in the authentication traffic. A small one. A handful of requests that didn't match the normal rhythm. They weren't loud. They weren't trying to break anything. They were just there, watching. He sat up straighter. He scrolled. He cross-referenced. He pulled up the logs from the previous week. The pattern wasn't there. He pulled up Friday, Saturday morning, Saturday night. There it was, faint, almost invisible. Somebody was inside the system. Not loudly, not obviously. They'd gotten in through a vendor connection, a third-party service the credit union used for cross-border wire verifications. It was a low-priority pathway, the kind of thing security audits sometimes overlooked because the traffic volume was tiny. But once you were in, it was a stepping stone. From there, you could probe deeper, map the network, find the higher-value targets. Marcus knew exactly what this was. He'd read about attacks like this for years. Slow, patient intrusions, the attackers studying the system, waiting for a high-volume window, then striking. He called his manager, David Kessler. David was a decent guy, mid-50s. 2 years from retirement, he answered on the fourth ring, sounding like he was already in bed. Marcus explained what he'd found. There was a long pause. Then David said, very carefully, "Marcus, we have a new CEO starting tomorrow. The board has been on edge for months. If we kick off a security incident report on her first day, it's going to look like we're handing her a disaster." Marcus said, "We are handing her a disaster. The disaster already exists. We just have to deal with it. Look, just monitor it tonight. Don't escalate yet. Let me think about how to package this in the morning." Marcus didn't say anything. "Marcus, don't go around me on this, please." "Understood." He hung up. He didn't go around David, not officially. But he also didn't go to bed. He poured another cup of coffee. He pulled up the architecture diagrams he'd been maintaining in his own private notes for years. And he started working. He couldn't shut the system down. Cardinal Heritage processed payments around the clock. Stopping operations would cost the credit union millions, and it would tip the attackers off that they'd been spotted. So he did the only thing he could do. He started building isolation barriers, quiet ones, soft walls inside the network that would catch the suspicious traffic and route it into a holding area. Like setting traps that look like ordinary doorways, the intruders would think they were still moving freely. They'd just be moving in circles. It was the kind of work that required absolute focus. One typo and you could lock legitimate customers out of their own accounts. He worked through Sunday night. He worked through Monday. He worked through Monday night. He kept Lily on her routine. He drove her to school. He picked her up. He made her dinner. He read to her. He put her to bed. Then he went back to the laptop. His next-door neighbor, Mrs. Harmon, was a retired schoolteacher in her 70s. She watched Lily in the afternoons. Marcus had asked her to stay later that week. He told her he had a big project at work. He didn't say what. By Monday night, he'd built a working defensive perimeter. The attackers were still inside, but they were now moving through a maze he'd designed. Every move they made was logged. He was learning their methods. That's when he found the second thing. The thing that made everything worse. The attackers had planted a kill switch, a dormant trigger inside the core processing cluster. It was harmless under normal conditions, but it had one specific job. If anyone performed a standard system restart, the most routine maintenance task in the building, used multiple times a week, the trigger would fire. Every defensive layer Marcus had built would collapse instantly. The dormant pathway would activate, and the attackers would have a clean shot at the core. Marcus stared at the screen for a long time. He understood what this meant. The attackers weren't planning to break in slowly anymore. They were waiting for an accident. A junior engineer running a routine restart. A scheduled maintenance window. Anything ordinary. He had to tell someone. He had to make sure no one touched the system until he could neutralize the trigger. He started writing it all down. Detailed notes, patch documentation, step-by-step warnings. He saved the file in the team's shared repository. He titled it clearly. The very last line in larger font read, "If I am not available, do not perform any restart of the core services under any condition. Call me first. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack." He left his cell phone number. It was 6:14 on Tuesday morning. Marcus had been awake for nearly 50 hours. He sat down at his workstation on the operations floor. He told himself he'd close his eyes for 2 minutes. Just 2. He didn't open them again until Helena Whitman was standing in front of him. Now we come back to that morning. You already know what happened next. Helena saw him asleep. She didn't ask. She didn't check. She walked him out. Here's what you didn't see. Tyler Chen, the junior engineer Marcus had been mentoring, watched his mentor leave the building on a security escort. He sat at his desk for a long time doing nothing. Then he opened the team repository. He found the file Marcus had written. He read it twice. He didn't fully understand all of it. The technical layers were beyond him. But he understood the bottom line. Don't restart the core. He thought about taking it to David, the manager. He thought about emailing the new CEO. But he was 26 years old, 6 months out of his probationary period. He'd just watched a 15-year veteran get walked out of the building before his coffee was even cold. Tyler did what 26-year-olds do when they're scared. He kept his head down. He told himself that the senior people knew what they were doing. He went back to his other tickets. Up on the executive floor, Helena was holding her first all-hands meeting. She talked about accountability, about discipline, about the difference between comfortable and excellent. She was a good speaker. People applauded politely. She had no way of knowing what was happening 17 feet below her. The system was operating normally. The dashboards looked clean. That was Marcus's work. His isolation barriers were still holding the intruders in their maze, even with him gone. To anyone glancing at the displays, it looked like a quiet morning. It looked that way until 11:42 a.m. That's when the troubles started. A processing queue began to slow down. Transactions taking 3 seconds instead of 300 milliseconds. The on-duty supervisor, a guy named Greg, 14 years at the company, saw the slowdown and made the call he'd made 1,000 times. Let's restart the cluster. Clear the memory buildup. Should take 90 seconds. Tyler heard him from across the room. Tyler stood up. He thought about the file, about Marcus's last words to him, about the 4 words he'd said before he walked out. Don't restart the core. Tyler walked over. He cleared his throat. Greg, Marcus left a note. He said don't restart anything. Greg looked at him, patient but distracted. Marcus was suspended this morning, kid. We don't take operational orders from suspended employees. I know, but it's a routine restart. I've done 1,000 of them. We're losing transaction throughput. Move. Tyler hesitated. He was 26. He was scared. He'd already watched one man's career end that morning. He didn't say it again. Greg ran the restart command at 11:47 a.m. For the first 90 seconds, the system actually looked better. Queue times dropped. The processing returned to normal speed. Then the authentication tokens went out of sync. It started small, a handful of transactions reporting strange state errors, then a few dozen, then several hundred at once. Greg's expression changed. He started typing fast. He pulled up logs. The logs didn't make sense. Outbound transaction routing began redirecting. A subset of high-value transfers were being shunted toward endpoints outside the credit union's verified network. Reconciliation was failing silently. Nobody on the floor knew what they were looking at. Within 12 minutes, calls started coming in from member service. A small business owner in Toledo, trying to make payroll for 14 employees, got an error message saying his transfer had completed, but the money was nowhere visible in the receiving account. A retired schoolteacher in Akron, trying to send her grandson tuition money, watched the same thing happen. A nursing home administrator in Youngstown, trying to pay a vendor, called in panic. By 12:05 p.m., the credit union was bleeding, and the only person who knew exactly how to stop it was asleep on a sofa in a small apartment in West Park, fully dressed, one shoe still on. Helena was called down from the executive floor at 12:11 p.m. She walked back into the operations center for the second time that day. The room had transformed. The monitors that had been calmly green that morning were now solid red. Engineers were moving between stations with the tight, controlled urgency of people who knew exactly how bad things were and didn't want to say it out loud. She asked what was happening. A senior engineer turned to her. His face was pale. He'd been at Cardinal Heritage for 19 years. "Ma'am, I think we just shut down all the defensive work that was keeping us alive. I think Marcus was holding the system together by hand for the last 48 hours, and we just took him out of the equation." Helena didn't understand at first. Then she did. She felt the floor tilt slightly, like the moment after you realize you've stepped on something fragile and broken it, just before you look down. "Where's our CTO?" "On bereavement leave, ma'am. His mother passed last week. He's in Florida." "Get him on the phone." "He's at the funeral." "I don't care if he's at the funeral. Get him." The CTO answered. He was helpful. He was knowledgeable. He was strategically excellent. But he was honest about what he didn't know. The legacy infrastructure, the parts that had been patched and repatched over 15 years. That was Marcus's territory. Always had been. He'd told the board for 2 years they needed to bring in a second senior engineer to share that load. The board had said it wasn't in the budget. Helena hung up. She walked over to Tyler Chen. She remembered him from the morning. The kid Marcus had spoken to on his way out. "What did he say to you when he left?" Tyler told her, word for word. Helena closed her eyes for a moment. "Show me what he wrote." Tyler pulled up the file. Helena read it, all 12 pages. She read the timestamps. She read the patches. She read the warnings. She got to the bottom line. "If I am not available, do not perform any restart of the core services under any condition. Call me first. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack." She stared at it. Below the warning was a phone number. Nobody had called it. She turned to the senior engineer. "Get me his address now." Cardinal Heritage's HR system had Marcus's home address on file. Helena had it printed and in her hand within 4 minutes. She didn't call a car. She drove herself. The apartment was in a working-class neighborhood. Old brick buildings, American flags on a few porches, the kind of street where the people who fix things live. Plumbers, nurses, bus drivers, the customers her credit union existed to serve. She parked at the curb. She walked up to the second-floor unit. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. The door opened. A small girl stood in the gap, maybe 7 years old, wearing a school uniform shirt and leggings. Her hair was a little messy. She had a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The rabbit was missing one button eye. The girl looked up at Helena with the calm, careful gaze of a child who had learned to read adults early. "Are you here for my dad?" Helena couldn't speak for a moment. She had not known there was a child. There had been nothing in the file that mentioned it. There had been no photo of a daughter on Marcus's desk that morning. Just a coffee mug with a stick figure drawing. The drawing was of this girl. Helena understood that now. "Yes," Helena said quietly. "Is he home?" The girl nodded. She opened the door wider. The apartment was small. Clean, but in the way of someone who cleans because they have to, not because they have time to enjoy it. Everything was functional. The couch, the kitchen table with a math worksheet on it, a bookshelf with library books stacked sideways, a small framed photo on the wall, a man and a woman in a hospital holding a newborn baby. The woman was smiling, but her face was thin. Her head was wrapped in a pale blue scarf. Marcus was on the couch, asleep on his side, still wearing the same plaid shirt from that morning. His jacket was on the floor, one shoe off, one shoe on. A glass of water sat untouched on the coffee table. His laptop was open beside him, screen still cycling through monitoring dashboards. He looked, Helena thought, like a man who had not chosen to lie down, like a man who had simply run out of anything left. The girl whispered, "Daddy hasn't really slept since Saturday. He said something bad was happening at his work. He said he'd rest after he fixed it." The words hit Helena with a force she hadn't expected. She looked at the apartment again, at the math worksheet, at the photo on the wall, at the child who'd opened the door for a stranger, because she was old enough to know that sometimes adults came to the door, and you had to be polite. She thought about every assumption she'd carried into the operations center that morning. The certainty she'd felt. The image of him sleeping at his desk that had fit so neatly into the story she'd already decided to tell. The story of the comfortable, undisciplined company she was here to fix. She had been so certain she understood what she was looking at. So certain she didn't need to ask. She knelt down so she was eye level with the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily." "Lily, I'm Helena. I work with your dad. We need him to come back to work for a few hours. It's an emergency. Is it okay if I wake him up?" Lily considered this very seriously. She looked at her father. She looked at Helena. She looked at her stuffed rabbit, as if asking its opinion. Then she said, "Mr. Pebbles thinks it's okay, but you have to promise to bring him home soon. He's really tired." "I promise." It took several attempts to wake Marcus. He came back the way deeply exhausted people do, in layers, one eye, then the other, confusion, then recognition, then a look on his face that wasn't anger, just the specific weariness of a man who had been handed one more demand he hadn't asked for. He sat up slowly. He didn't say anything. Helena sat in the chair across from him. "I didn't listen to you this morning. I made a decision in 10 seconds based on what I thought I was looking at. I was wrong. The board will deal with that. Right now I need to tell you the system is failing. Greg ran a restart at 11:47. Nobody in the building understands your patch architecture well enough to stop what's happening. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. Not surprise, just the heavy quiet of being right about something you hoped not to be right about. He pulled the laptop toward him. He scanned the dashboards for less than 60 seconds. He set the laptop back down. He didn't stand up immediately. He looked at his daughter first. "Lilybug, have you eaten?" "Yes." "Did you finish your math?" "Almost." "Will Mrs. Harmon come over if I have to go back to work?" "She said yes for the whole week." He nodded. He pulled her into a hug. He held her for maybe 10 seconds. Then he looked at Helena. His voice was quiet. "I'm going back. Not because of the apology, not because of the job. There are people who use that credit union to make rent and pay for medicine and run small businesses. They didn't sign up for any of this. That's the reason. I want to be clear about that." Helena nodded. "Understood." He stood up. He changed his shirt. He kissed Lily on the top of her head. He picked up his laptop and his jacket. They walked to the door. He looked back at his daughter once. Lily waved at him with the rabbit's paw. Marcus almost smiled. Then they got in the car and drove back downtown in silence. When Marcus walked back into the operations center, the room shifted. It wasn't celebration. It was something quieter. The specific relief of a group of people who have been managing a problem beyond their capacity and have just seen the one person with the relevant capacity walk back through the door. He didn't acknowledge it. He sat down at the main console. The seat was vacated for him without anyone being asked. He spent the first 8 minutes doing nothing but reading. Logs, current system state, a summary of every intervention the team had attempted since the restart. He listened without interrupting. Then he started giving orders. He didn't bark them. He spoke quietly, but the orders kept coming in clean sequence, and people moved fast. 5 engineers were assigned to isolating the redirected transactions. 2 more to building a mirror pathway that would track exactly where the stolen funds were being routed. A 3rd group to prepare a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. Someone from legal was sent to call the 3 biggest enterprise clients with a careful, accurate, but non-alarming script. Marcus also asked for 2 specific things that surprised people. He asked Tyler Chen to sit beside him and write down every command he issued in order so that future engineers would have a reproducible recovery procedure. A real one, with timestamps. And he called the FBI's Cyber Division. This was a federal financial institution. There were laws, there were obligations. The credit union had been the victim of an attempted theft. The proper authorities needed to be involved. He didn't ask Helena's permission for either of these things. He just did them. Helena watched. She didn't interfere. Over the next 4 hours, the bleeding slowed. The redirected transaction pathway was severed from its connection to the core. 3 suspended high-value transfers were quarantined before any funds left verified accounts. 17 specific changes to the authentication configuration closed the pathway the attackers had built and removed the key from the lock. There were losses. Smaller batches required manual reconciliation. 2 enterprise clients received formal incident notifications. The federal investigation that followed would be extensive. But the catastrophic outcome, a massive, public headline-making theft from a 500,000 member credit union, had been averted. At 4:23 p.m., Marcus confirmed the authentication layer was fully stable and the intrusion pathway was permanently closed. The room exhaled. Helena, who had stood at the back wall the entire afternoon, felt the tension leave her in a wave that almost made her dizzy. Marcus didn't celebrate. He drank a glass of water. He turned to Tyler. "You got everything down?" "Yes." "Good. Type it up tonight. Send it to me before you go home. We're never in this position again." Tyler nodded. Marcus stood up. He looked tired in a different way now. Not the desperate exhaustion of crisis. Just the deep, ordinary tiredness of a man who had finally been allowed to set something heavy down. He walked out of the operations center. Helena followed him. In the elevator, she said, "I'll have a car take you home." "I'd appreciate that." That was it. That was all they said. The board emergency meeting happened the next morning at 8 a.m. Helena requested it herself. She stood in front of 7 directors and the chairman. She did not deflect. She did not soften. She gave them the timeline in plain English. 48 hours before I started, an engineer named Marcus Reeves identified a sophisticated intrusion. He reported it through proper channels. He was told to keep quiet. He spent the next 2 days defending the system on his own time, with no support, while raising a child alone at home. On my first morning, I walked into the operations floor, saw him asleep, and suspended him without asking a single question. I rejected his attempt to tell me what was happening. 3 hours and 45 minutes later, the system collapsed. The attack reached the active phase. We are extremely lucky that we lost nothing more than time and reputation. We are extremely lucky because of 2 things. First, the work Marcus had already done before I walked him out. Second, the fact that he agreed to come back when I asked him to. Several directors looked at each other. The chairman, an older man who'd been on the board for 20 years, leaned forward. "What is your recommendation, Ms. Whitman?" "Reinstate Marcus Reeves immediately. Public apology. Full back pay for the suspension. A bonus that reflects the actual value of what he did. And then, and this is the most important part, we are going to make some changes to how this institution treats the people who do this work, so that what happened to him can't happen again to anyone." She paused. "I'd also like the board to formally evaluate my own conduct. I don't want to be insulated from consequences. If you decide I'm not the right person to lead this place, I'll accept that." The chairman looked at her for a long time. "We'll talk about your role later, Ms. Whitman. Right now, what changes are you proposing?" Helena had a list. She'd drafted it at 3 in the morning, sitting at her kitchen table in the dark. The first change was an escalation policy. Any frontline engineer who identified a credible security risk had a direct, guaranteed path to executive leadership. Middle management could not block it, could not slow it, period. The second change was a rotation policy. No single engineer could be the sole holder of critical institutional knowledge. Pairing was mandatory, documentation was mandatory, and the company would invest in cross-training, so no one ever again sat where Marcus had sat. The third change was a whistleblower protection policy. Any engineer who raised a genuine security concern was protected from retaliation by contract, with teeth. The fourth change was the most personal. A mental health and workload monitoring program for high-stress technical staff. Real one, not a poster on the break room wall, real check-ins, real support, real coverage when someone needed time off. And the fifth change was about leadership culture. "I am going to require myself," Helena said, "and every member of the executive team to spend 1 full shift per quarter on the operations floor. Not as inspectors, as learners. We are going to know the people who keep this institution alive. We are going to know their names, and we are going to remember that every line on an org chart is a person. The board approved every item. The chairman did not ask Helena to step down. He said one thing as the meeting closed. The day a leader stops being able to recognize their own mistake is the day they stop being a leader. You're still a leader, Ms. Whitman. Get to work. Marcus came back the following Monday. Not out of vengeance, not out of triumph. He came back because his daughter needed health insurance, and because he genuinely cared about the place, and because the new policies meant something. He'd read every line. He'd asked for 2 changes. They were both incorporated. He took the promotion the board offered, not for the title, for the salary increase, which meant Lily could stop sharing a bedroom wall with the apartment's noisy heating unit. They could move to a quieter unit on the top floor. The thing he negotiated for hardest, before any number was finalized, was simple. He wanted a guarantee that he could leave the office at 5:30 p.m. 3 days a week, to pick up his daughter from school, to make her dinner, to read to her before bed. The board agreed without discussion. Tyler Chen got promoted too. Marcus insisted on it. Tyler became the 2nd senior engineer for legacy infrastructure. He and Marcus paired on every critical system over the next year. By the end of that year, Tyler could read Marcus's old notes the way a translator reads a familiar language. Greg, the supervisor who'd run the restarter, was not fired. Helena had wanted to fire him at first. Marcus talked her out of it. He did what 14 years of training told him to do. The failure wasn't his. It was upstream. We fix the upstream. We don't punish the man for following the rules he was given. Greg ended up running the new operations training program. He helped write the new escalation policy. He told the story of the restart to every new hire for the rest of his career. He didn't soften it. He didn't dress it up. He just said, "This is what happened. This is why we don't operate that way anymore." About 6 weeks after the incident, Helena was walking through the main lobby on her way out of the building one afternoon. It was early evening. The light was coming through the front windows in long golden stripes. She saw Marcus near the entrance. He was kneeling down, adjusting the strap on a small pink backpack. A girl was telling him a fast, emphatic story about something that had happened at school. A bird had gotten into the classroom. The teacher had screamed. It was apparently the most exciting thing that had ever occurred in the history of human civilization. Marcus was listening, with absolute attention. His face was open, lit from within in a way that professional competence never produces. He wasn't a senior infrastructure engineer in a building. He was a father at the end of a long day. That was all he needed to be. Helena watched for a moment from across the lobby. She had learned, in the last 6 weeks, to recognize the moments that belonged to other people. She walked over. She crouched down. "Hi, Lily. Do you remember me?" Lily looked at her seriously. She nodded. "You're the lady who came to my house when Daddy was sleeping. You promised to bring him home." "I did. I'm glad I kept my promise." Lily considered her with the careful judgment of a 7-year-old. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Helena gravely. "I drew this for you. Mr. Pebbles helped." Helena unfolded it. It was a stick figure drawing of 3 people, a man, a small girl with a stuffed rabbit, and a woman with brown hair, identifiable by her slightly larger size and the briefcase in her hand. All 3 figures were holding hands. Helena looked at it for a long time. She didn't say anything. She just folded it back up carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her blazer, against her chest, where she kept things that mattered. She stood up. She looked at Marcus. He wasn't smiling exactly. But there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Something not quite forgiveness, because forgiveness wasn't really the right word. Something more like the peace of having watched a person earn back what they'd lost. "Have a good evening, Marcus." "You too, Helena." She watched them walk out of the lobby, father, daughter, stuffed rabbit. Then she stood there for another minute, thinking about the woman she had been 6 weeks earlier. The one who'd been so certain she knew what a building looked like. She did not miss that woman. She turned. She walked out into the parking lot. The sun was setting over Cleveland. The next day, on her desk, she put a small framed copy of the drawing right next to her computer, where she'd see it every morning. This is the part of the story most people don't tell. Most stories like this end at the apology, or at the promotion, or at the public reckoning, the dramatic part, the satisfying part. But the real story isn't the crisis. The real story is what changes after. Cardinal Heritage didn't become a perfect company. It became a slightly better one. Marcus didn't become a hero. He became a man with a slightly easier life, who got home in time for dinner more often than he used to. Helena didn't become a different leader overnight. She became a leader who'd been forced to learn that authority without listening is not strength. It's a very expensive kind of blindness, and it doesn't go away just because you've recognized it once. You have to choose every single day to keep your eyes open. Years later, an interviewer asked Helena what the most important lesson of her career had been. She didn't tell the dramatic version. She didn't tell the story of the cyber attack. She just said this: every person you walk past in a building knows something you don't. Every single one. The cleaner, the receptionist, the engineer asleep at the desk. They are all carrying something you cannot see. And the day you forget that, even for 10 seconds, even for a single bad morning, is the day you become dangerous to the people you're supposed to lead. She paused. It took me a daughter with a stuffed rabbit to teach me that. I hope you learn it cheaper than I did. The interviewer asked if she was still in touch with Marcus. She smiled, a small private smile. He still works at the credit union. His daughter's 11 now. She's going to be an engineer, apparently. She's already better at coding than I am. And you? I keep her drawing on my desk. Every morning, before I go into a meeting, I look at it. 3 stick figures holding hands. It reminds me of something simple. What's that? Helena looked at the camera. That every story about a company is really just a story about people. And if you forget the people, you don't actually have a company. You just have an org chart waiting to fall apart. The interview ended there. Outside the window, somewhere in Cleveland, a credit union was running quietly in the late afternoon. 500,000 members, hundreds of employees, one slightly better culture than it used to have. And somewhere on a top-floor apartment, an 11-year-old girl was doing her homework at the kitchen table, occasionally consulting a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Pebbles, while her father made dinner in the next room. It was an ordinary evening. It was the whole point.